Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, alongside guest historian Jesse Alexander, we'll continue our exploration of the remarkable story of the Canadian Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. We'll look at famous actions in 1917 and 1918 and consider what the war means for Canadians today. Well, hello again, gentlemen. A pleasure to be joining you on part two of our two-part look at the Canadians. And last week, of course, we started this survey and it turned out to be just a topic that was just too big and too interesting to condense into a single episode, Dan.
Yeah, hi, Spence. It really was, actually. And just purely from my point of view, sitting there and listening to a real expert with real passion about the subject, talking about it, really got enthralled myself. So I'm really glad that we get a chance to come back and finish off the story. We could certainly have extended this far longer, but for the time being, we're going to be looking at 2 episodes. And of course, we need to bear in mind that we finished last week's episode with a look at the famous action at Vimy Ridge, where the Canadian Corps fight as a single corps for the very first time. And from that point onwards, we're going to, of course, advance through the remainder of the war alongside the Canadians with a look at famous occasions such as Passchendaele. We're going to look briefly at Hill 70. We're going to look at the battles of 1918 and eventually the advance to victory. And of course, once again, we've got Jesse Alexander with us, who's going to be able to shine a light from a Canadian perspective, which actually I've got to add is really handy for me because I'm down with a little bit of cold this week. And for a change, it means I can sit back and just enjoy the show. So Jesse, if it's not too much trouble for you, we're gonna lean on your heavyweight shoulders of historical knowledge with the Canadians this week.
Well, I'm glad to be back. Of course, you don't have to convince me that the story of Canada in the First World War is too big to fit into one episode, but I hope that you listeners out there are getting at least some insight into the fascinating story that is Canada and Canadians in the First World War. Don't worry, Dan, the Canadian cavalry has arrived, and I will take some of the weight off of your voice for today. That's a foreshadowing, by the way, for something we're going to talk about, a famous action in 1918. But I guess to just quickly paint the picture to catch folks up who might not have listened to the first episode yet, and to orient ourselves, we kind of left off in about mid-1917. As you mentioned, we covered Vimy Ridge, the famous action there. The Canadian Corps now has 4 divisions. It's established as some of the best shock troops in the British Army, alongside the Anzacs and some British units as well, of course, British formations as well. And while the Canadian Corps is fighting and becoming more effective and achieving some significant victories after its kind of growing pains in the first years of the war, there's trouble brewing at home. And one of the main topics, as we discussed last time, is the conscription question. And it comes to a head in 1917 in a way because there's an election. And I mentioned last time that this is a very contentious election, that most French Canadians oppose conscription. They're not very happy with the way they're being treated inside Canada by the Anglophone majority, by the Conservative Party government that's in power during the First World War, that encourages and allows reductions in the rights of French Canadians, that doesn't have a bilingual army. So there's only one single battalion in the Canadian Corps that functions in French, and only at the battalion level. It's the 22e, 22nd Battalion. So if you're a French Canadian village dweller or lumberjack or farmer or factory worker, you're obviously not that comfortable if you're going to be A, conscripted into a war for the British Empire, and B, forced to do that in English. I mean, basic training is no fun for anyone. Imagine if it's in a language that you don't understand, which most French Canadians at the time did not understand any English whatsoever, most of them being rural and living more isolated. So there's a very bitter campaign on this topic. The Conservative slogan essentially for the election is, "Don't let the Quebec slackers, run the country. We want conscription." And so they give the right to vote to some women, only those who have relatives in the army, which helps them win the election, as does the split in the Liberal Party, which splits mostly along language lines. The French Canadian MPs stay in opposition. The Anglo-Canadian MPs of the Liberal Party, most of them join the Conservatives, and they form a union government, basically of Anglo-Canada versus Franco-Canada. There are some exceptions to that, but that's the basic divide. So it's a very, very serious problem. Some people fear this could cause civil unrest, which it will, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And some fear it could even split up the country or cause a civil war, which it eventually does not. But these are some of the very extreme fears. And they're played out in the newspapers. You have French-Canadian nationalists bitterly writing about how they do not want this and it's not right, and comparing the Anglo-Canadian imperialists to the Prussians, as I mentioned last time. But then you have some French Canadians who are in favor. They see almost, and I don't want to push this comparison too far, a bit like in British India, where the idea is if we show that we're a part of this community, that we defend the democratic and liberal values of freedom in the British Empire, as the establishment saw them at the time, for European subjects in the empire. If we do that as French Canadians, we're going to have a better situation. We're going to be able to counter these school policies that restrict access to French. We're going to have more respect. They're not going to say we're an inferior race and that our language and culture should die out and so on, as some Anglo-Canadian leaders had said. So you even have serving officers like Oliver Asselin or Talbot Papineau, who we'll talk about a bit later, who write in and say, no, we need to do this. This is how we're going to forge a new Canada where French Canada is equal. And so there's this huge, bitter debate. And the Conservatives win the election, form a union government with the Anglo-Liberals, and force through conscription against the will of Quebec. And so this is all happening while the fighting is going on and while Canadians are under these different tensions at the front and at home. So it's kind of a rock and a hard place, I guess you could say.
It's really interesting because as you were describing these international, interlingual tensions, and I was just thinking about how when we discussed America, United States a few episodes ago, right, the tensions there to different races and different linguistic groups in the USA. And I was also thinking about the tensions within Great Britain between the English, Scots and Welsh and the Irish. Of course, Ireland was never subjected to conscription because of tensions there. And I think that's something that we're often forgetting in the First World War, that within apparently homogenous countries, there can be quite significant tensions. And you've really laid out in a lot of detail, a lot of interesting detail, just how severe these tensions are in 1917. And you said something that really struck me, in that fears of a civil war in Canada. And that's something that I think might surprise a lot of listeners. But as you say, this was a real fear at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't only a fear or a sentiment held by politicians. I remember, and this will be a very short excursion, we'll get back to the front. But I remember that my uncle and aunt, in the 1960s, I believe, they bought a house in my hometown in Quebec. And the woman who lived in the house was an elderly woman. She was alone, never married, never had kids. And so she left all her stuff. She'd passed away, and they sold the house with all her stuff in it. And in there, which my mother, with foresight, preserved, and I inherited then, was a big box of correspondence from the war years, the First World War years, between this woman, Bertha was her name, and several Canadian and British soldiers. It's amazing. There are like almost 100 letters. And one of the passages that stuck with me the most is that they're both complaining about French Canadians. These were two Anglo-Quebecers, like my family, writing about their fellow neighbors, saying they're cowards. They don't want to fight. The French in France, they're real Frenchmen. They're fighting, but ours don't want to. And so it really gets down to a personal level of animosity against the people who share your community. And that's one of the big tensions in the legacy of the First World War. On the other hand, of course, the front and the Germans don't care a lick about what's going on in Canada, and say at the Battle of Passchendaele, you've got to fight if you're a soldier in the Canadian Corps, no matter what the situation is back home, no matter what your personal opinion is. So the Canadians play a significant role at Passchendaele. I don't know, Spencer, do you want to set us up for what's going on at Passchendaele? Why did the Canadians get thrown in? And then maybe I'll throw a little spice of what their experience is like.
It'd be my pleasure. So we've discussed, we did a full episode on Passchendaele, listeners, of course, which is, I believe, from memory is episode 5, if you want to go back and listen to that. But of course, the circumstances, I think, from a Canadian perspective are interesting. We discussed, or I should say you discussed last week, Jesse, Vimy Ridge, and that this solidifies this idea that's, I think, has been growing in British High Command's mind for some time, that the Canadian Corps is an elite corps, alongside the Anzacs, later the Australian Corps, and also certain British corps who were sort of marked down as capable of doing a job. And the Vimy Ridge has really solidified that. And within the context of the wider British Army, is getting better at assaulting the German lines, can reliably break into the German lines, if not yet break through them. In 1917, the Germans are adopting their own defensive network, varying defensive network, the so-called Lossberg system. Lots more on that in the earlier episode, listeners. And what we start to see in the British Army, I think, is a real sense of confidence that the Army can now attack and break through. And it's borne out by evidence. The opening of Arras, Messines Ridge, up to Third Ypres. Now, talking about Third Ypres, we discussed in a full episode, but Third Ypres doesn't go according to plan. German defences are sophisticated and complex. The rain comes down endlessly, turns the battlefield into an awful quagmire. Progress is measured in inches almost. Absolutely appalling battle, incredibly draining for the British Army. The one battle I think that the British Army fights which demoralizes it. And into this, you're going to get the Canadian Corps is going to be brought into a situation that by the time they arrive, it's not a very promising situation, Dan.
No, and it really isn't. And as we'll see, particularly towards the end of the battle, when the Canadians really play a key part, the situation has deteriorated to something that's almost impossible to make any real progress. But in order for those guys that perhaps haven't gone back or haven't heard for a little while the story of the Passchendaele campaign, let's just briefly paint a quick picture. And there's an analogy that we can use on the battlefields I think works quite well, and it's the famous story of the pebble in the pond. Now, if you take the idea of Ypres being the city at the heart of the Ypres salient, which of course is really a bulge in the line on the Western Front, and you were to use the analogy of Ypres being the pebble, and you were to drop it into a still pond, what you would get is a series of ripples that would radiate outwards. And in this case, it's radiating to the north, to the east, and to an extent the south as well. Those three ripples, if you like, are going to be the key areas that the Brits are trying to capture. It's first of all, it's the Pilkem Ridge. Second, it's the Broodsind Ridge. And third and finally, it's going to be the Passchendaele Ridge. Now, there are much broader possibilities here. There's the idea of sweeping round to Bruges, capturing some channel ports. They're a little bit pie in the sky, those ones, to be perfectly honest. But there is a very real objective as well, slightly behind that third ridge, and that's the capture of Roulers, of the rail hub, which services most of the Ypres salient from a German perspective. But really, what we're talking about when we think of the Canadians' involvement here is the fight between the second and the third of those ridges. The Australians have been brought in midway through the battle. The battle, by the way, is kicked off 31st of July. Seen some success on that opening day. Eventually, the Brits have been ground down. The Australians have been brought in to assault the Broodsind Ridge. And finally, quite late on in the battle, really, by October, we're going to see the Canadians come into the line, Jesse. And they're going to be the guys that are going to be fighting for that third and final ridge.
Yeah, the Canadian Corps is brought in for the final push. And by then, of course, no one, with the exception, I think, as you mentioned, Spencer, in that Passchendaele episode of the podcast, no one, with the possible exception of Haig, is very enthusiastic about what's going on at Passchendaele. And neither are the Canadians, and neither is the Corps commander, Arthur Currie, who has taken over in 1917 command of the Canadian Corps from Julian Byng. And Currie's a big deal for us Canadians because he is a Canadian from British Columbia, and he's now in charge of the Canadian Corps. We'll talk about his reputation and qualities as a commander a little bit later. But he is reluctant about what he's been ordered to do. And he predicts, he says, okay, we can probably take Passchendaele Ridge, but it's going to cost us. It's going to cost us something on the order of 16,000 casualties. And in the end, it costs a couple hundred less than 16,000. So he knew his business. He knew this business of trench warfare, of bite and hold tactics that were being applied at the time. He's reluctant, but of course, orders are orders. So the Canadians enter the line, and he tries to meticulously prepare in order to make the best of a pretty awful situation, a pretty awful order that he's been given to capture this ridge under these conditions of basically a sea of mud with a prepared defender. They pay a lot of attention to logistics, making new roads, putting in more of these little light tram rail lines and so forth, trying to make sure that the attack is planned as well as possible with the greatest chance of success and the fewest losses. They've already used this meticulous recipe, for example, at Vimy, but also at Hill 70, which is an engagement near the French town of Lens in August, where the Canadians take this German strongpoint and they're able to mess with the German plan of transferring a few divisions north towards Passchendaele to defend against the earlier phases of the British offensive there. So that's one of the, there's a nice new memorial, by the way, at Hill 70. I haven't been to it since it's been unveiled. But if you ever go and visit the Western Front, there's a new Canadian memorial in there for the Canadians among you, I suppose, at Hill 70. In any case, this is what the Canadian Corps tries to do. Ironically, or I don't know, bitterly perhaps, when they arrive in the line in the third week of October, they find they're in very, very close to where the very first Canadian major battle of the war took place at 2nd Ypres, and the 1st Division was there in April 1915. They're in some cases, not more than a kilometer away from those initial positions in 1915. So that's not great for morale, I guess, when 2.5 years later you walk up to the same general area and trench systems as the men did 2 years before you. The idea is that the Canadians are going to take this ridge, this final ridge, in 3 attacks. That's the plan anyway, October 26th, October 30th, and November 6th. And these are painstaking advances in this sea of sucking mud. I think in your Passchendaele episode, you had a great quote. It's like a monster that's like sucking at you. Well, this is what the Canadians come into. Sometimes they lose the objective, the tactical objective, to a German counterattack, then they take it back. By the famous objectives, famous when you're looking at the battle, the significant objectives, you can see the scale of what we're working at. Wolf Copse, Crest Farm, Vapor Farm, First Farm, a crossroads of 2 small rural trails or 2 small rural roads. I mean, this is small scale stuff. And you're talking about 2 divisions attacking at once to take these singular farms. So it's extremely painstaking advances. Eventually, of course, by the 10th of November, they put in an extra 4th attack, and they are able to clear off much of the ridge, not entirely all of it, but much of it, and the village of Passchendaele. And it's really not impressive as a ridge. When you're walking along there now, it looks like a tiny, tiny bump in the landscape. But of course, when you've got a whole bunch of Germans in shell holes and pillboxes with machine guns backed up by artillery, and you're slogging through waist-deep mud, there's some very famous images of Canadian machine gunners at Passchendaele in just an absolute wasteland of unrecognizable mud and shell holes. That's a tall task. And they're able to do it. The final attack captures the ridge actually, or most of the ridge fairly quickly. But they take these 16,000 casualties. And one of them I want to talk about in a little more detail, unless, Spencer, I have missed anything in my little summary of the capture of Passchendaele Ridge.
No, I think you've painted a really good picture that by this time in the campaign, it's clear that the long-term objectives, clearing the ridges, breaking through to the U-boat pens on the other side, getting onto the Belgian plain, it's just not going to happen. The situation for the Allies has deteriorated from when the offensive begins. Russia is now plunged into a Bolshevik revolution. Even this vague hope that post-Tsarist Russia is going to do something, that's gone. The army's exhausted, as I mentioned. All aspects of the army are exhausted. The artillery are exhausted. The air force is exhausted. Everybody's worn out. And yet there's still this last lunge for the Passchendaele Ridge. And one thing to make really clear that will become controversial after the battle is basically that the ground that the Canadians take, and as you say, they take most of the ridge, not quite all of it. There's actually a disastrous night attack to try and clear it at the very end of November, start of December that fails. It can't even be held. It's basically stuck out on a limb. It's not quite a salient, but it's very vulnerable to any kind of German counterattack. And so there's this huge, heroic effort through this ghastly mud, appalling conditions. It's very cold by then as well, against very determined German resistance. And it succeeds, as you say, almost to the man in terms of calculation. But in the fallout from the Battle of Passchendaele, which has huge political ramifications in Britain, absolutely massive ramifications, in fact, the effort almost seems, it almost seems to epitomize the I don't want to say the word futility, but just the cost, the sheer cost of Passchendaele, that you fought so hard, and by now Passchendaele village is just a pile of bricks. And the Canadians have done it against all the odds. You put in your best batsman, and he has hit to the boundary, but what cost? And coming following on from the very controversial political side of the debate, which you laid out for us at the start of the episode, and the tensions in Canada, this cannot have been a very pleasant pill for the Canadian public to swallow.
Absolutely not. And this is one of the reasons why Passchendaele, for those who remember the war, and there are many, as an exercise in futility, Passchendaele looms large, right? It doesn't get, you couldn't imagine a starker symbol of futility if that's the way that you perceive the war, if that's the narrative that makes sense to you. And it did to many, many post-war writers and in the 50s and 60s and so on and so forth. If you drill down to the individual level for Canada, beyond the complex political situation and the question of conscription and so forth, Canada may have lost a leading light. Now, there's a bit of speculation involved in this battle, because one of the officers who has been very vocal on the question of conscription, very vocal on the question of Canada's future Anglo-French, well, English and French-Canadian relations internally, I should say. His name is Talbot Papineau. Now, for non-Canadians, the name Papineau probably doesn't mean much other than, oh, it sounds French. Maybe it sounds a bit like butterfly if you know papillon, right? But he comes from a long and prestigious lineage in French Canada. Although he himself was from a branch of the family that was mostly culturally anglicized, he still had this very strong awareness of his lineage. He's an officer in the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, Talbot Papineau is. And he's descended from a French-Canadian rebel leader who led a big rebellion in the 1830s against the undemocratic British colonial rule, and that failed. But he feels that he is carrying, and many other Canadians feel, especially in Quebec, that he's still carrying this torch of, we want a Canada where English and French speakers can get along, and that has its own identity and that's independent of Britain while being associated with Britain. And he articulates this vision. And he articulates this vision, for example, in a 1916 letter that I'm going to quote from right now. He says, "As I write, French and English Canadians are fighting and dying side by side. Is their sacrifice to go for nothing, or will it not cement a foundation for a true Canadian nation, independent in thought, independent in action, independent even in its political organization, but in spirit united for high international and humane purposes to the two motherlands of England and France? As a French minority in a great English-speaking continent, we must rather seek to find points of contact and of common interest than points of friction and separation." So you can see he's quite eloquently making the case here in this public letter in a newspaper for participation in the war. Now, he's at Passchendaele by choice because he serves in the PPCLI. He then gets a desk job as a staff officer away from the front. But in 1917, he decides to go back and rejoin the frontline unit for, as best we can tell, two reasons. One is the camaraderie and the loyalty. He feels bad about having left his fellow soldiers and officers in the frontline unit, and he wants to go back to them. Today, we'd probably say there's an element of trauma involved in that you cannot break away from that kind of traumatic experience very easily in the military. But he also revealed to some family members that he thought that after the war, he would be interested in getting into politics. And since he had such a prominent name, and he was from a more or less upper class / middle class, upper middle class, let's say, background, he would check the boxes for a successful Canadian politician, or potentially. And part of the reason why he went back to the frontline unit was so that he could say, I've seen more action, and that would give him more political capital after the war. That turned out to be a bad decision because on the morning of October 30th, right before they go over the top, he turned to his neighbor, another officer in the PPCLI called Major Hugh Niven, and he said, "You know, Huey, This is suicide. And indeed, he was then hit by a shell on that attack, and they never found his body until, I want to say, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. They managed to identify an unidentified Canadian body as being his. So Canada may have lost a future prime minister who had a vision of a united Canada. And of course, as you know, since the war, we've had lots of difficulties with the idea of a united Canada. Tiny bit of trivia. Talbot Papineau was played by none other than Justin Trudeau, current Canadian Prime Minister, in a TV docudrama in the early 2000s.
The echoes of history. Really interesting sort of snippet. I'm reminded of, some of the gilded generation, sometimes referred to the Edwardian upper classes who perish in the First World War. Prime Minister Asquith loses a son at the Somme, for example, Raymond, and there's the casualties that are suffered not merely amongst the common soldier, the working man, if you will, but also in the higher levels of society, and what effect that actually has. And yet, the Canadians ultimately achieve their objective, such as it is, not the entire ridge, but the core of the objective is taken in conditions that are almost beyond belief, beyond description. The photographs tell part of the story. And they survive this, but of course the war's not over. They have to then recover, repair, reinforce, reorganize, try and absorb lessons and so on. And there's one thing I think it's quite striking about I mentioned just a few minutes ago about the state of the British Army after Passchendaele. It's how demoralized the army is. It just feels it's been asked to do the impossible, which it largely has. It's been a nightmare fighting there. The army's exhausted and so on. The army has to recover its senses because the German spring offensive is looming, and it's obvious that's going to be coming from December 17 onwards, really. And I wonder if you could just paint a picture for us, Jesse, of the state of the Canadian Corps in early 18, because it's gone through the really highs and lows in 1917, the glory of Vimy Ridge, the incredible sacrifice and hardship at Passchendaele. And yet it is still certainly ranked by not only the British, but also the Germans as one of the British Army's finest fighting formations. So what's the secret of this? What makes the Canadian Corps such an elite formation?
Well, there are a few factors. I think we might have touched on a couple of them in the last episode. But one thing is, well, first of all, in the immediate term, they get some rest. Because the first part of 1918 is relatively a quiet time for the Canadian Corps. They're not directly involved in taking the brunt of that German spring offensive, so they have time to lick their wounds, and their wounds are, of course, many. Even though the Corps is considered an elite formation, shock troops of the British Empire, what have you, they're having trouble replacing their losses. This is why the conscription debate happens and why it eventually gets passed and implemented, but it's going to take time. It's not like Parliament passes the conscription law and the next day new guys start showing up to fill out the ranks in the units. This is a question, this takes months and months for this to happen. But they have strengths to build on, even if they're exhausted, even if they've taken these heavy losses. The Canadians are a cohesive corps. Right? The divisions are not being rotated in and out of this corps like they often are in the core of the British Corps or of German Corps or French Corps, what have you. So they maintain this cohesiveness, the staff, different relationships between officers. They're used to working together. Also, 4 divisions is a very substantial corps. Sometimes corps are 2 divisions, sometimes they're 3 divisions. 4 is a pretty overpowered corps. And the Canadians are actually overpowered compared to British formations in other ways as well. They retain more artillery per division in the corps than a British corps would have. They also retain more infantry battalions per brigade, whereas the British by 1918, due to manpower shortages, they're reducing from 4 to 3 battalions. The Canadians keep their 4. So a Canadian brigade is not the same animal in a way as a typical British brigade. They've got more men and they've got more firepower. And so I think that's a bit of an underestimate. We like to talk about the Canadian fighting skill and spirit, and that absolutely plays a role. But the raw numbers and firepower for what they are, they can punch above their weight. And then, of course, there's the question of command with Arthur Currie, with whom I'm sure you're familiar, Dan.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to bring something up actually whilst we're talking about the kind of state of play when we get to January of 1918, because I know we have mentioned this on the podcast before, but I think it's such a fascinating document that it's definitely worth exploring in a little bit of detail here. And this goes back to a German report, which was actually produced on the 1st of January 1918. And it was never designed to be seen by Allied hands. Of course, later it has come out that way. And what it is, it's effectively it's a pre-spring offensive German evaluation of all of the British and Commonwealth units who are on the Western Front at that time. And what it does is it classes them into 5 different categories. The 5th class is mediocre, 4th class is average, the 3rd is good average, the 2nd class is a good attacking division, and the 1st is an outstanding division. So the entire British Army is going to be ranked amongst this system. There's a couple of caveats to this. One, they rank a couple of divisions that don't even exist, which tells you it's maybe not completely flawless. And of course, secondly, it depends on the experiences the Germans have had facing those divisions. But I just want to run through it, and I want to do the whole list actually because it's so fascinating and it gives us a good idea. If we go to mediocre divisions briefly, so we've got divisions. Some of them are fairly surprising actually. So you've got the 6th Division, it's seen as a mediocre division. That's a regular British Army division. You see the 38th Welsh, who actually have a fairly tough time on the Somme, but probably not all their own doing. They have a very tough gig on the when they attack through Mametz Wood. We've then got the 57th, 61st, and 62nd. So that's the West Lancs, the South Midlands, and the 2nd West Riding divisions. The 66th East Lancashire division. They're all rated really as the lowest tier according to the Germans. Average divisions include a few regulars as well. So the 4th and 5th divisions, the 10th Irish, the 13th Western, the 17th Northern, and then a number of other divisions, predominantly Kitchener divisions, who are going to find themselves in that number. Interestingly as well, the 5th Australian Division, who are going to be late into the fight. They're also given as being only average. Now, if we go a little bit higher, we look at good average divisions. We've got the 8th Regular, we've got the 14th Light, the 16th Irish, who you could argue should have been quite a bit higher up in that. You've got the 23rd, 35th, and the 46th North Midland Division, who have a real chalk and cheese war in 1916, and then again in 1918. Now, if we get towards the spearhead, if you like, of the better rated divisions, according to the Germans at least, we find the 1st and 2nd and the 3rd British regular divisions, the 11th Northern, the 15th Scottish, really highly respected formation, at least in the BEF's order of battle. And then we've got the 47th, the 2nd London Division, and then we see 2 Australian divisions, the 3rd and the 4th. Now, you notice no Canadians mentioned yet. That's because when we get to the outstanding divisions, you find all 4 Canadian divisions. In its entirety, the list reads the Guards Division, British 7th, the 9th Scottish Division, the 29th Division, the 33rd, the 51st Highland Division, 56th or the 1st Londons, 63rd, the Royal Naval Division have only been formed at the start of the war, and then 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th Canadians, 1st and 2nd Australians, and the 1st New Zealanders. That's quite shocking, really. If you look at that, half of the divisions that are rated at the very top of the tier are Commonwealth units, according to the Germans. And in a way, Jesse, I think the Germans are probably quite happy that actually when the spring offensive comes knocking, actually they're not having to face the Canadians in any meaningful way, at least in terms of big numbers.
Yeah, and I would like to point out on behalf of my now fellow Canadians from Newfoundland that the Newfoundland Regiment was in the 29th Division. So even if you weren't in Canada at the time and only joined the Federation later in the 1940s, hey, there must be something in the air over in the North Atlantic region. I don't know. But yes, moving into 1918, the Canadians are aware as well, I think, of this role. They're under a very competent commander in Arthur Currie. He wasn't that great at managing his own personal finances. Before the war, he got into all sorts of legal trouble about financial matters and real estate deals and so on. But hey, he found his calling in the midst of this crisis, became a divisional commander, and is now in command of the Canadian Corps. At the beginning of 1918, help is on the way, as I mentioned, in the form of conscripts. I think we can finish off the story of conscription at this stage, maybe a little bit, because the law is passed in 1917, but then it's only really implemented with any degree of consistency and thoroughness as of January 1918. And they conscript over 100,000 men in the end. I think it's about 125,000 men that they conscript. The vast majority of men who are eligible for conscription, they request an exemption. So you can see the pool of willing volunteers is absolutely dried up. But nonetheless, they conscript about 125,000. Only about 24,000 of those end up at the front. And one of them was my great-grandfather. As it happens, a French Canadian, Albert Chabot, as he was born, we would call him Albert Chabot these days in our anglicized side of the family. And he gets conscripted into the local battalion. He's from a village outside of Ottawa, the capital, a village called Carleton Place. Shout out to Carleton Place if there's anybody listening from there. The 2nd Eastern Ontario Battalion. We don't know why he didn't volunteer. So we don't know if he was politically motivated or he just wasn't interested or what have you. We have no family records of that. But he is now going to be in the fight. The fight is going to take a while till the Canadians get into it, because the first major action for the Canadians comes already when the German offensive has kind of run its course. The Brits have taken those terrible losses, sort of weathering the storm from March to July. The French as well, of course, it must be said. And then the French and Americans go over to the offensive in July. And then the British, Canadians, and Australians and New Zealanders. God, I don't want to forget them. Sometimes I've forgotten them in the past, and I get flack for that, understandably. So this all happens starting the 8th of August, right? Which is this famous counteroffensive, the spearhead with the Canadians and Australians and New Zealanders on the 8th of August. So, Spencer, do you want to set up what we in Canada call Canada's 100 days? Never mind the 100 days offensive. It's Canada's 100 days to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, listeners, if you're interested in a longer discussion of this, we have covered this in a previous episode. But so the situation down for the British, and by that I'm including, of course, all the British contingents, the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, etc. The situation is that the front stabilised. The Franco-American counterattack at the Second Marne has really started to turn the tide dramatically. The Germans are now going to be defensive for the remainder of the war until they're eventually defeated. Their offensive capacity is spent. And they have this huge bulge on the Somme sector that's pointing at Amiens. They're pointing at the city, this crucial logistics hub. And the British are really keen to counterattack, clear that threat to the logistics. And also they sense, correctly, it should be said, there's been small actions against the German bulge through July. Particularly the Australians are nibbling away at the edge of this. They sense the Germans are in a vulnerable position. This is not a defensive position as strong as that which the Germans left. It's been constructed relatively hastily in a matter of weeks rather than a matter of years, as part of the front has been constructed over. And now is the time. The Germans are clearly on the back foot. The British can strike them really hard here, can push them right back across the Somme terrain that's been lost all the way to the Hindenburg Line. And to do this, really, the British pull off a bit of an operational coup in that they assemble a really powerful force, including the largest number of tanks the British have put into a single battle up to this point in the war, over 500 tanks. Plus, they've got all of their big hitters, all of their big batsmen are coming out. The Australians, the Canadians, some of the crack British divisions are going to be there. And it's going to be really the sort of the pinnacle of British combined arms. And it's going to deal a huge crushing blow to the Germans, and the Canadians are going to be in the forefront of this.
Absolutely. And so are the Australians and New Zealanders. And I think I want to take this opportunity here and now on the podcast. I want to offer an olive branch to all the Anzacs out there, to all the Australians and New Zealanders. We both love to claim that we won the war, that our corps were the ones who really broke the backs of the Germans, who had the most advanced form of combined arms warfare. Oh, was it at Le Hamel? Was it somewhere else where Canadians were, at Amiens, or whatever? Look, let's just agree that we both had elite formations that contributed to the end of the German army and punched above their weight. Can we agree on that? I think that would be a nice little informal agreement to have. Well, I don't know how the Brits here feel about that.
Yeah, let's not let that one slide without at least a conversation. Actually, I think it's very interesting. Actually, particularly when we come to the Australians, of course, we've been covering the Australians a fair bit throughout this series as we go, and of course, weighing heavily on the scales of the who won the war or who came up with the concept that eventually won the war. You have to look at events like Le Hamel, so the assault in July 1918. I think they call it the 93-minute attack. It's one that's predicted to last 90 minutes, end up 93. We see a miniature version of what eventually is gonna formulate the assault on the 8th of August 1918. Yeah, absolutely. There's some impressive stuff there. Monash, who is regularly put forward, and quite often I think put forward alongside Currie as the two most influential generals of the Great War. I would certainly argue that they punch above their weight. I don't think there's any argument there. I think that one can be pretty much agreed in terms of what they do. But then you could also argue that they should be punching above their weight because of the strength and power of both of those corps. I think what we need to throw in here, Spence, to give the Brits at least a little bit of defense is the idea that, well, did these ideas come exclusively from those guys? Or could we argue, for example, that Monash perhaps was a disciple of the British General Plumer, who maybe showed how this could be done at the Battle of Messines?
A great comment, Dan. And absolutely, there's two things I'd really like to pick out about this. One is that the national divisions within the British Army are not as clear as they are now 100 years later. At the time, Canadians and Australians, if you saw them in the street, if you were, say, an American soldier and they didn't speak to you and you couldn't see their insignia, you would not be able to tell them apart from the British. So they're much more closely bound than perhaps we understand today, where national armies are very distinct. And I've used the phrase previously about the Australians and the Canadians that they're proto-national armies. And I think that stands. They're contingents of the wider British Army. They use British equipment. They follow British doctrine largely. And crucially, and this is the second point, they follow British training. And one of the successes of the Australian Corps and the Canadian Corps is it trains very well. And it trains very well, one, because training is improving across the British Army, especially from early 1917. But one thing that the core system has as an advantage for the Australians and the Canadians is it keeps everybody together. You're less vulnerable to reorganization, because one of the big problems the British Army has is it doesn't really keep its core as single corps. Instead, it uses them as a sort of administrative block, and it rotates divisions through them. And that's got advantages. It gives the British Army a lot of flexibility. It creates a certain level of continuity in sectors. But what it does diminish is training, because you're rarely going to have constant comings and goings. A division arrives, and it's not just the infantry. It brings all its staff, its engineers, its artillery park. They all arrive. They work with other divisions. Then one division rotates out, and so you lose that consistency. Whereas with the Canadians and the Australians, they're not so vulnerable to that. They're much more homogenous. And when we talk about the value of that homogeneity, it's largely because of training. Yes, there are reorganizations within the Corps, but nothing like the British see. And so the Corps train really hard. And I've seen some work done, particularly on the Australian side of the question, to show the Australians spend more time by 1918 training than doing anything else. And they have that ability, and it's not being lost. So it's not a case if you train 1st Australian Division really to a really high standard, really pleased with that, oh, they're being rotated out, they're going to another corps. Instead, they're always staying together. And it also encourages lots of inter-corps sharing of ideas, because you get to know people within the corps. Connections are tight. There's a lot of advantages to this. And so combined with the fact that the Canadians are not heavily mauled in the German spring offences, the Canadians have become this really powerful reserve formation. We're fully recovered from Passchendaele. They're not just sitting around twiddling their thumbs when they're not in the line. They're going through a lot of hard training, homogenous, with an unusually high standard of leadership throughout. And one thing we haven't mentioned is there's some terrific British officers actually within the Canadian force. Alan Brooke, who will go on, of course, to be Field Marshal Alan Brooke in the Second World War, Churchill's strategic advisor. You have Edmund Ironside, who will not have a successful Second World War, but is a terrific brigadier and goes on to be a field marshal in World War II. You've got really quality officers at all levels with this high level of training, with this high level of coordination. And now's the time. Now's the sort of perfect time to put them in. They are highly trained, highly experienced, well led, and they're now fighting with all the equipment and all the doctrine the British Army's developed over 4 years. You know, you've got all the tools of modern war. And it's going to pay off on the 8th of August, 1918, at least if you're on the British side, not so much if you're on the German side.
Yeah, no question about that. I think also in the interests of Commonwealth solidarity, it's worth remembering that corps like the Anzac Corps or the Canadian Corps, they are kind of fully integrated into the British Army in terms of logistics, intelligence, air cover cooperating with the air forces. There's artillery support that's lent sometimes depending on what the action is. For example, there was British artillery supporting the Canadian Corps allotted to it at Vimy Ridge, and so on and so forth. So you can't isolate a lot of the activities, and in some sense, you can't fully isolate the successes of the Anzacs or the Canadians as well. There's my olive branch to you Brits out there at the same time. Olive branches all around. So I wanted to also say that the reputation of the Canadian Corps that we've been talking about is something that contributes to the success, hopefully, of the Amiens offensive before it even begins. Because a few Canadian units are transferred to the Ypres salient as a disinformation action. So to trick the Germans into thinking, well, maybe the Canadians are up there, we should watch out near Ypres in the northern part of the front. Because we know, the Germans might say, where the Canadian Corps is, because they're an elite corps, that's probably where we got to expect some trouble. So the Allies, the British, purposely transfer some Canadian units up there, very briefly, small elements of units, I would say, in order to cause the Germans to think that the Canadians are in the north. I don't know if that was very successful or not, but that was the attempt. And I think it speaks to then the reputation and the expectation on the German side. The Amiens offensive begins. This is the big turning of the tide in 1918. In addition to the Franco-American offensive, shouldn't forget them, of course, as you mentioned, Spencer. The Canadians are successful. They're on the southern flank, if memory serves, of the Anzacs. They capture, in the space of 5 or 6 days, about 9,000 Germans, and they advance about 23 kilometers. I mean, this kind of stuff is unheard of in 1915, 16, and 17. So they're doing something right. Of course, this comes at a cost as well. The Canadian Corps' heaviest casualties are going to be taken in this 100-day offensive, or Canada's 100 days, however you want to qualify it. They lose about 20% of their casualties for the entire war in the last 3 months of action. And they also win, if memory serves, something like almost half of the total number of Victoria Crosses won by Canadians during the whole war are won in those last 3 months. So the outcome is becoming more and more clear as success is coming on the battlefield, but it's certainly not getting any less costly and not getting any less dramatic. And one of the instances of that cost and that drama is the case on August 8th and 9th of a Canadian lieutenant in the French-Canadian, the only French-Canadian unit, the 22nd Battalion. His name is Jean Briand. And he's a lieutenant. He's in command of a company. And he wins the Victoria Cross for his actions on August 8th and 9th. And I think this is the kind of thing that Canadian small units are doing in order to achieve this success. Just to summarize his contribution on these 2 days, he leads this company to capture 150 German prisoners, 15 machine guns. He personally kills 7 Germans during these actions in these 2 days. He's wounded 3 times. And the last time he's wounded, he collapses while leading a rush right into the teeth of a German field gun. So that, I think, summarizes quite a bit of what's going on here. We've got the Germans on the back foot. I should say, I wasn't there. The Canadian Corps has the Germans on the back foot, which creates a different kind of fighting. You're storming a field gun in the open. This is not something that would happen as frequent or would not be as likely to happen in the previous years of the war. Now, Briand succumbs to that last wound and dies of his wounds on August 10th, but he's posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Unfortunately, we'll come to this a little bit later, he's not very well known in his native Quebec because the memory of the war took a different turn in Quebec compared to in English Canada. But nonetheless, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention his case here.
So the 8th and 9th of August, this huge hammer blow hits the Germans. Ludendorff describes it as the Black Day of the German army. Famous quote. Any British history or Anglophone history is going to quote that. Never mind what's happened to the German army down at the Second Marne, where they had almost 20 divisions written off in one go. But this is the moment that the British, of course, coined the phrase the 100 Days. They want to connect it to the famous 100 Days that saw the end of Napoleon. And so it starts from a British perspective on the 8th of August. But of course, it doesn't end with the 8th of August. Battle of Amiens, great victories that it is for the Allies. The Germans are driven back, but they're going to retreat into the Hindenburg line, and they're going to fight every step of the way. And one thing we sort of really got across on our American episode, and you've made clear, Jesse, is the fighting starts to change. You're not going from trench to trench in the way that you were in 1916 or 17. One thing that I think could be surprising is if you look at photographs from the 100 Days, it's how often soldiers are in ruined villages, or they're just in patches of woodland, or they're just in the open countryside. It's much more, a very different war, much more like 1914, or even 1940, given the number of tanks and low-flying aircraft that are around. But there's constant fighting. It's not a procession to the end. The German army is fighting pretty hard right until November, really. And the Canadians are still in the thick of the action. And I think some of those actions have been forgotten about, but I know that you want to sort of correct this for our listeners a little bit and highlight some particular actions.
Well, I think what happens is the 100 Days is a very convenient framework for us, 100 years on, for people who are interested in history, but not into every little detail and haven't studied it like a specialized historian might do, is, then we beat them and beat them and beat them, and then it was over. But that really yada yadas, if I'm going to use a little Seinfeld reference here, that yada yadas over a lot of very important stuff. For example, a couple of the significant actions for the Canadian Corps include the storming and breaking of the Drocourt-Quéant line, which is kind of a part of the Hindenburg line. It's near the town of Arras, which is no stranger, of course, to fighting. And the Canadian Corps arrives there after their success at Amiens. They arrive there at the latter part of August. And they break this position, the Drocourt-Quéant line, which is quite a significant German position. They break it in the last couple days of August and the first couple days of September, for example. So this is of particular importance to me because my great-grandfather is involved in this. This is his first major action. So remember, he's a conscript, right? He's from a village in Eastern Ontario. He's never been to France before. He's never seen the Atlantic before, probably. And now he finds himself, after having been conscripted in January, sent to France in July. At the end of August, he's in the thick of this massive offensive. And it doesn't last long for him. Because on the morning of August 30th, his very first day of his very first major engagement, he gets struck in the left arm by shrapnel, and it shreds his left arm below the elbow. So they need to amputate it. And he's one of the very, very, very few Canadian conscripts to have become an amputee, to be that seriously wounded in the war. So it's a very, very unusual case. And of course, one that had a huge impact on my family. Every picture of him after the war, he's hiding his stump because he was very emotionally affected by being handicapped afterwards. It wasn't something that was very accepted sometimes in the community. So every picture, he's hiding it behind his back. Also, there's an interesting letter that we have from the chaplain to his girlfriend at the time, Margaret, a Scottish-born woman in the village. And the chaplain just says, he's been wounded, but he's doing fine. He's going to be sent back to England and then to Canada. He doesn't say that his arm got torn off and he's a cripple now, probably because he didn't want to worry her. But of course, she found that out in the end anyway when Albert returned to the village. And Margaret's family said, he's a nice guy, but cancel those marriage plans because he's a cripple and he's not going to be able to provide for you. And this, of course, is a problem faced by very, very many disabled veterans. But in this case, anyway, Margaret says no. And that's not an easy thing for a woman to do in 1919, is to say no to her father. But she says no, and she marries Albert anyway. And that's one of the reasons why I'm sitting here today, is because of the courage that she showed in respect, partly, of the courage that he showed, I think. Maybe I'm getting a bit melodramatic here, but that's how I sort of interpret my own connection to this particular battle. But before I wax too emotional here, I want to move on to the next engagement, which is the Canal du Nord, which Currie said was the most impressive military achievement of the Canadian Corps in the entire war, including Vimy. There's this big canal. It's an industrial region, right? In northern France, the most heavily industrialized region. So they have created this canal for moving coal and other industrial goods and that sort of thing. You've got to cross this now. The Germans are not fools. They're going to try to use all these positions to defend themselves. And it's a very tricky thing. How are you going to cross this wide canal? Much of it is flooded, but there are a few parts that are unfinished and they're still dry. So, to make a long story short, the Canadians develop a bit of a risky plan. They fight their way across some of those dry areas. They put up some bridges quickly at night over the non-flooded parts, and they're able to surprise the Germans and cross the canal and gain a permanent foothold on the other side. And the Canadians win 8 Victoria Crosses just crossing that canal that night. And once they get to the other side, the next German position is on a high wooded hill called Bourlon Wood. There's also a very nice Canadian memorial there today. And in the memorial park, there are some old trees that are original to the battle. They were standing there when the battle occurred. But there's an absolutely wild Canadian cavalry charge, if you can believe it. In September 1918, Canadian cavalry, led by an officer named Flowerdew, of all names, he wins the VC. They charge this wood and take it from the Germans. So the Canal du Nord is an absolutely wild affair that should be much, much better known in Canada than it is. I don't know, Spencer, I don't know if that registers outside of Canada in terms of the drama and the achievement that's there.
Well, it does in this household, but in terms of its wider recognition or understanding, absolutely not. In fact, you'd need to be a pretty dedicated student of the First World War to have come across this. So thanks for bringing it up on the podcast. It's an incredible action. It almost defies belief. And I think perhaps one of the reasons it's not better remembered, because it is an incredible story, is it doesn't sort of fit the narrative that we have of the First World War as all murder and horror and futility. For example, War Horse, the play and the film, would have been very different if it had ended with that action, for example. But it doesn't quite fit. But there are incredible actions in the 100 Days because it looked so different. You have cavalry fighting alongside tanks with low-flying aircraft flying ground support missions over the top of them. It looks almost like no other period of the war, a really transitional period between World War I and World War II, and a fascinating period of the war, with the Canadians, of course, in the vanguard of this, as the German army is eventually driven to requesting an armistice and being defeated. And I suppose as we come to the end of this podcast, it's worth sort of reflecting on the importance of the Canadians and the Canadian contribution in the First World War. We dwelt an awful lot this episode, rightly, I think, on the fighting capacity of the Canadian Corps. And listeners, it's not just us sort of having a self-congratulatory discussion. This is very much the view at the time within the British Army, which can be very harsh on its own formations, incidentally, and the German armies we heard from Dan. Both Allies and the Central Powers regard the Canadians as a really powerful fighting formation. But let's sort of fast forward a little bit and bring it to the present day. And a lot's changed, of course, in 100 years. Views of the war change. Memories of the war, as you've just mentioned, Jesse, change. Where do we see the Canadian war effort now, a century on, and indeed 10 years after the centenary?
Well, the legacy is a complicated one, let me put it that way. But I think Dan wants to get in here before we dive into the legacy aspect, before we leave the military story fully behind.
Yeah, gents, I do. I just want to raise something here because it's something that I've covered in a little bit of detail before, and I always find interesting. I think it adds an important full stop behind the Canadian story in the Great War, albeit a slightly tragic one. Because, of course, when we come to the 11th of November 1918, 11 a.m., the Great War is going to come to an end. At least it's going to come to a pause, as we've previously discussed on this podcast. And, the losses that all sides have sustained are going to be staggering. But there's always got to be a last casualty. Each nation's got its story of last casualties. Famously, the Americans lose a man within seconds of the armistice. And tragically, the Canadians are not too far behind. In fact, the last British or Commonwealth casualty of the Great War is going to be a Canadian soldier, and ironically going to be suffered in Mons, where the first British casualty of the Great War is going to be suffered. Mons is an unusual space, as we've discussed before, Spence. Really, it's the name is synonymous with the Great War, but actually in terms of its involvement in the Great War, it bookends the battlefield as a whole, because for the vast majority of the fight, Mons is well behind in German lines. But actually by the 11th of November 1918, the Canadians, along with British soldiers, have pushed all the way back to the outskirts of Mons, and in fact, just beyond it. And it's just beyond Mons on the 11th of November 1918 at 10:58 a.m. that a Private George Leonard Price is going to be shot and killed, shot through the chest, actually, as he runs from house to house less than 2 minutes before the end of the war, and it's going to become the last, as we say, Canadian or Commonwealth casualty of the Great War. And rather ironically, for those that ever get a chance to go to the battlefields and experience these locations, he's today buried in San Symphorian Military Cemetery, and he is one row, one grave behind a certain Lieutenant Maurice Dease, who wins the first Victoria Cross of the Great War, defending the Nimy rail bridge with a machine gun. So those two men, separated by something upwards of 1 million lives, are buried about 3 foot apart. It's a really powerful point for me, and one that I always find fascinating. But of course, as we've mentioned, the story of the Great War, whilst the fighting might stop on the 11th of November, the story and its impact and its legacy has got much longer legs than that, Jesse.
Yeah, it does. And some of those roots of the legacy of the war come from those last days at Mons, and some of the divisive aspects of the legacy of the war for Canada as well, because after the fighting was done, Sam Hughes, who I think I mentioned in the previous episode, who was the Minister for Militia and Defense, quite an unusual character, quite a ferocious politician, and held a lot of personal grudges. He didn't like Arthur Currie very much, and his son happened to own a couple of newspapers in Canada, and so he accused, through his son's newspapers, Arthur Currie of wasting Canadian lives by attacking Mons in those final hours when the armistice had already been decided upon, according to Hughes's attack narrative. And there's a whole debate after the war, of course, about futility. This is one part of the legacy of the war in Canada, which is familiar to other societies as well, is that the war was a pointless waste, that it was an evil of imperialism. There's a famous novel written by a Canadian, Generals Die in Bed, pushing this idea, this interpretation that the generals were callous and it was all pointless. Of course, in French Canada, there's a particular version of this, which is related to their collective experience, having conscription forced upon them in the midst of this kind of aggressive imperial idea of a British Canada and no French schools and so on and so forth. This experience in First World War for Canada for French Canada, I should say, is one of the reasons why Quebec starts to drift to some extent into these ideas of, well, maybe we might be better off away from them, separate from the rest of Canada. It's not a one-to-one. It's not a one day they're fine and the next day they all want to separate. But it's one chunk, it's one step along that line of thinking for those Quebecers who do want to separate from Canada. It's bolstered a little bit by the traumatic experience in the First World War. So those are some of the, let's say, negative legacies. But there's, of course, a different legacy as well, which is, I think, still the most common. Also, it's the official one throughout the decades of Canadian authorities, the government, and so on. And that's this idea of pride in the achievement and sacrifice of the Canadian soldiers who were thrown into that situation and performed the way that they did, that the cause was just against Germany, but that even if there are some questions about the justness of that cause, we should still, in principle, honor those who are willing to sacrifice themselves. And another variation on this theme is that the First World War was a stepping stone in Canadian identity from a colony or a dominion to a more independent-minded nation. Historians will say, rightly, that it's much more complex than that. It's much more nuanced than that. But that is still an idea, a narrative that rings true to many Canadians to some extent, on some level. And I certainly felt all of those different legacies in my own family history, in my own upbringing, and in my own experience as a tour guide at the Vimy Ridge Memorial, for example. So that's one of the things that I tried to bring to these two guest podcast appearances with you.
I just want to just raise that for a second, Jesse, because it's fascinating. I know a lot of the guys that have been out on the Western Front and who are listening into this, guys and girls, we should say, have experienced the Western Front, and many of them would have been to Vimy Ridge, of course, one of the iconic spots to go and visit. Seeing as you've got that first-hand experience and no doubt interacted with many visitors, Canadians, non-Canadians, what's your kind of overriding memory and feeling of those conversations? Did you feel that people came in generally with a good balanced view of how the war was fought on the Western Front, or did people tend to see it through a completely Canadian lens or completely British lens, depending on their own national affiliation? Is there any were there any lessons that you drew out of that personally in terms of your understanding of the Great War?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very, very formative experience in my life. I can firmly say that I've never been the same since then, professionally, intellectually, and probably to some extent as a person as well. I'd never lived abroad before, so my personal experience is kind of bound up in the professional experience of guiding. But I think there's a mixture. One of the lessons I took about how people interact and engage with the First World War is just how different it can be for different people, whether it's nationality, as you mentioned, whether it's generation, whether it's personal connection to the current day military, or what have you. And that is something I underappreciated which I can forgive myself for. I was 21 years old and never really spent any time outside of Canada in my own bubble when I worked there. But that was an eye opener. And sometimes it was an eye opener in a really positive way, in a sense. Like, so many British people had so many positive things to say, respectful things to say about Canadian history, about Canadians. That really touched me. I didn't realize that those kind of feelings and opinions were so widely held in the UK and also in France. At the same time, I realized how, for me, what had been a very far away kind of mythical, holy place, Vimy Ridge on the other side of the world, for people who grow up and are born next to a battlefield from 100 years ago, for them, it's the nice, pretty Canadian Memorial Park next door where I want to go jogging with my dog, or where we want to go for a family walk after Sunday lunch and a couple of bottles of wine. And I don't mean that in a bad way necessarily. Of course, at the time, I had very mixed feelings about it. But it really helped me to see how such a tragic and dramatic event can have such a different connection to different people's lives, and that my own connection is not the only one that's out there. It's not the default one. It's just because that's what I was raised in. So I think those scales, in a way, fell from my eyes. And that was quite an interesting experience. Also, giving a tour to German military about the battle made me really think, well, how do I want to present this? How do I want to talk about this? How do I want to word things? How can I be also respectful to them? Because I think sometimes when we're within our own national group or within the Commonwealth cultures and countries, we can let slide a little joke here or a little comment there. And you would never do that when you're talking to a German audience out of respect for them. And going through that experience, I think, also influenced how I think about history and how I think about doing public history and communicating history to a broader kind of international public, like we do on the YouTube channels that I work with and on the World War II audio podcast that I work with as a part of your team.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and I can tell you my very first ever visit to a battlefield, very first ever visit, was to Vimy Ridge, and it stuck with me as well as a visitor, and no doubt has stuck with you. It's it's a fascinating place to go and explore, and if you guys do get a chance, by all means go out and pay a visit to Vimy Ridge. It's really one of the iconic spots of the First World War. But of course, we have to end somewhere, and why not with the memories of Vimy Ridge end right here today? We want to say a huge thank you to Jesse Alexander for coming along and joining us. It's a pleasure as always, Jesse, and it's great to see that the brand new podcast, World War II, both sides of the wire, is going from strength to strength. So just give us a quick plug for anybody that wants to find out a little more.
Sure. I'm not just interested in the First World War, and I don't just talk about Canada. I have the great pleasure to co-host World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, with Professor Matthias Strom from Germany. And he brings in quite an interesting perspective. He's very well versed on the German side of things. And I think that's a bit of an underserved point of view in public history on World War II. And I try to throw in my 2 cents when it comes to France or the Soviet Union, or wherever I can get a word in edgewise, let's say, with Matthias. But yeah, we want to treat the war in a bit of a new way and make sure that we get that underexplored perspective from the Axis side, along with the fascinating story on the Allied side of the war. So that, in a nutshell, is what we try to do over on Both Sides of the Wire.
There we go. So, ladies and gents, make sure you check it out. We, Spencer and I, are both regular listeners, so it really is worth a look. So, thank you very much. As always, thank you to you, Jesse. Thanks to you, Spence. And for everybody listening, we'll see you again next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Nice. Well,
Great.
you carried that one, Jesse. Your back
good
must be
effort.
aching by the end there.
I'm good, dude. I almost brought tears to my own eyes a couple times.
Yeah, well, that's what it's
Jesus.
about. That's what you should be doing. A great story.